Hilchos Shabbos, Perek Shlosha Asar. Laws of Shabbos, chapter 13, the first full chapter dedicated completely to the topic of Hotza'ah Mirshut Lirshut, carrying from domain to domain, the 39th of the 39 Melachot. Yesterday we began the conversation, but today it's a full chapter, and this is our topic for the next week. As I mentioned yesterday, till the end of chapter 19, we're going to be dealing exclusively with this melacha of Hotza'ah, of carrying. I think it's worthy of mention, although I've used them already in the past, since today I made extensive use of them in our pictures, this wonderful book called Mishnayot Pnei Shabbat. It's a Mishnayos on Masechet Shabbat with beautiful illustrations and pictures to clarify all of the halachot. I've already used them in the past, but today again I made extensive use, so I figured it's worth to mention, to thank them in public for the benefit that they've provided to me in preparing this class, and hopefully to you in listening and understanding this class. So without further ado, let's get right to it. What's on the agenda for today? Three basic topics are going to be covered in this chapter. First of all, the concept that in order to be liable for carrying, you have to do two things. Akira v'hanacha. Lift the object from one domain and have it land, place it in the second domain. More specifically, a second topic, which will be discussed first, is that the places from which you lift and onto which you place have to themselves be important places. Halachically important. Halachically important means they have to be at least 4 by 4 handbreadths in length and width. 4 by 4 tfachim. It's about, every tefach is about 4 inches, so let's say 16 by 16 inches. That's what helps the place constitute as a halachically important place to consider lifting, and consider landing to be landing. And the third topic at the end of the chapter is going to involve throwing things, how throwing interplays with the malacha of carrying. So let's get right to it. Halacha Aleph, Ein hamotzi mirshut lirshut, o hama'avir birshut harabim chutz la'arba amot, chayav. In order to be liable for the malacha of carrying from one domain to the other, or transferring within the public domain a length of 4 amot, a person is not liable ad sheya'akor chefetz, till he first has to lift the object, and not just lift it. He has to lift it me'al gabei makom sheyesh bo arba'at tfachim al arba'at tfachim o yoter, from a place that has an area of 4 by 4 handbreadths or more. V'yaniach, and he has to place the object down. That's step 2 in the carrying process, and not just place it anywhere. Al gabei makom sheyesh bo arba'at tfachim, on a place which has 4 by 4 handbreadths. So we got 2 rules in one. The 2 places have to be halachically qualifying places, and there has to be 2 acts to consider it carrying, lifting and a placing. Now says the Rambam halacha bet, yado shel adam chashuva lo ka'arba'a al arba'a. The hand of a person becomes important in the eyes of man, and it assumes the status of a place of 4 by 4 handbreadths, because a person considers it important. Lefichach, therefore, im akar hachefetz miyad adam ha'omed birshut zu. Were you to lift an object from somebody's hand sitting in this domain, and then place it into another person's hand, so you've done the lifting, you've done the placing, you've done the akira, you've done the hanacha, but one could make the argument that you only lifted from a hand and placed onto a hand. Hands aren't big enough to have 4 by 4 handbreadths, but since the hand is important to a person, it becomes like a place of 4 by 4 handbreadths, and therefore, chayav, you are liable. Or let's say, here's the first case on the screen. This is taken from the first Mishnah in Shabbat. The Rambam divests it of the circumstances of the case, but in the Mishnah it talks about a poor person and a homeowner who met on Shabbos. So if a person is standing in one of the 2 domains, upashat yado lirshut shniya, and he stretches out his hand to the other domain, the akar hachefetz mimena o miyad adam ha'omed ba, and he lifts the object from within the domain or from the hands of a person standing in it. The hechzer yado elav, and brings his hand back to him, chayav, he would be liable. This is the case given by the Mishnah. You have a poor man comes outside the person's house holding a basket. The homeowner reaches out, takes the basket into the domain. He's done the akira from the poor person's hand. He's lifted it off the poor person's hand. The poor person's hand is considered to be a halachically qualifying place, because it has 4 by 4 handbreadths. It's considered to be 4 by 4 handbreadths. And the man brings it in, puts it on his table. Now he's done a lifting and a placing from a place of 4 by 4 to a place of 4 by 4, and he's liable. Even if he didn't place it on the table as in the picture. Once he's holding it in his hand is also considered to be an important place. It's as though he's resting on the ground, and he has already done a placing, a hanacha, and that qualifies as a hotza'ah, as a properly binding halachic carrying. Halacha gimel. Haya ochel v'yotzei mireshut l'reshut. Let's say a person was eating and walking from domain to domain. And as he's walking, he has in mind that he wants to take the food out from one domain to the other. Chayav, that already makes you liable. 1 second. Lifting and placing, I see, you lifted it from, your mouth is in one domain, now it's in the other, but the mouth isn't big enough to have 4x4 handbreadths. Here too, the thought that you attach importance to the food to make it part of this journey considers it as though it's a 4x4 area. Even though you haven't carried the way people usually carry, as you said in the last chapter, carrying with your mouth isn't necessarily considered normal carrying, but over here you've made it into an important place. Similarly, if a person was standing in one of the two domains, the private or the public, and he urinated or spat into the other domain, chayav, you're liable, because you have lifted from one domain and placed it in the other domain. Even though in the case of urination and spitting, the place from which the urine or the spit leaves doesn't have 4x4 handbreadths. Nevertheless, your thought giving this act importance makes it as though you have lifted the urine or the spit from a place that has 4x4 tvachim. However, if you were standing in one domain and the edge of your organ stretched out to the next domain, and then you urinated, v'hishtin ba patur. Here you're totally exempt, because technically the place from where the urine left is already in the next domain, so you've just transferred from within one domain. Nevertheless, you can see it's only exempt, not permitted. It's rabbinically forbidden, because you don't want to go to just a small move can get you back into the other domain, and now you'd be considered doing a biblically liable act. Halacha dalit. Haya omed ba'achat mishtei reshuyot. If a person was standing in one of the two domains, upashat yado lireshut shniya, and he stretched his hand into the other domain, v'natal misham mayim me'al gabei guma mele'a mayim, and he took water from a hole which is now full of water. Here you have a case right just like that. Let's say there was a wall dividing the well between the kid and the well, and he stuck his hand over the wall into the other domain, takes out the water, and he brings them back to him. Chayav, he is now liable. Shahamayim kulan ki'ilu hin munachin ala aretz. The argument could be made, since you only took some water off the surface of the water, that water wasn't on a place that was 4x4 handbreadths. But we look at the water as the entire unit, says the Rambam, and all the water is as though they're resting on the ground. And therefore it's considered that you have taken it from a place that's 4x4, it's tfachim. Aval, says the Rambam, but if you had a vessel floating on the water and there was fruits in the vessel, you have a little canoe going down the canal, and you have a vessel, and you have fruit in the vessel. Now, the picture here is not so accurate because the canoe may be big enough already to be considered an important place. And so you have different issues. But let's say it was a small basket, okay, and there was fruit in the basket. And you stretched your hand out, took from the fruits and out into your possession, into your domain. Patur, you'd be exempt. Even though the water is considered to be resting on the ground, the fruit, the produce, never rested on any ground. It's as though you never lifted it from a place that has 4x4 tfachim. Again, as I said, this canoe would be an inaccurate depiction because the canoe itself may be 4x4 handbreadths. Needless to say, if the fruit themselves were simply floating on the water and you took out the fruits, patur, you're certainly exempt. You haven't taken the fruits off of a place that has an importance of 4x4 handbreadths. If there was oil floating on the water, and you simply brushed off some of the oil and took it out, patur, you'd be exempt because the oil is never considered to be resting on the water. Halacha he. Kvar amarnu, we've already said. Right? Implicit in the concept of 4x4 was the fact that you have to have akira v'hanacha, a lifting and a placing. But if you did an act in which you only did the lifting but not the placing, or the placing but not the lifting, patur, you'd be exempt. And here the Rambam comes to the next case, which is also taken from the very first Mishnah in the tractate of Shabbat. And again, the Rambam divests the Mishnah from its circumstances. He just makes it as if about two people. The Mishnah speaks about a case of a poor person and a homeowner, and we'll discuss it as such. Lefichach, therefore, Misha haya omed be'achat mishtei reshuyot. Somebody was standing in one of the two domains. Upashat yado lirshut shniya v'chefetz biyado. And he stretches his hand into the second domain with an object in his hand. In the case of the Mishnah, the poor man stretched his hand into the house with the basket. Unitalo acher mimenu. But somebody else, the homeowner, took the basket out of his hands. What happened here? The poor person did the lifting. He lifted it out of the public domain. But when he brought it into the private domain, just his hands went in. Even though before we said that your hands are considered an important place, that's only when they're in the same possession, same domain as your body. When they're simply stuck inside of a house, they don't become like a place of 4x4. And therefore, no hanacha, no placing has happened. The homeowner who lifted the basket hasn't lifted from anything outside the public domain. It's in the private domain. So he only did the hanacha. He placed it in his house, he only did the placing. Or the opposite would happen. The poor person put his hand into the private domain with nothing in it, and the homeowner placed the loaf of bread, in this case, onto the poor person's hand. He does the akira, he's lifted it in the private domain. The poor person, since his hands aren't considered an important place, because they're stuck inside the house, they don't have the status of 4x4 tfachim, he only pulls it out, and now he does the hanacha, the placing, in the outer domain. Someone else put an object in your hand and you brought your hands back. Here, both cases, both people would be exempt. Because one lifted and one placed. One caveat. When is all these laws said? Assuming that the hand that the poor person stuck in was higher than 3 tfachim above the ground. We have in halacha a principle that's called lavud. Lavud means attached or stuck. If something is within a distance of 3 handbreadths from something else, they're considered attached. So if the poor person's hands were to be so low on the ground as to be within 3 handbreadths from the ground, they would be considered as though they're on the ground. Even when he sticks his hand into the house, that would be considered as though it's placing on the ground. If his hands were within 3 handbreadths, close to the earth, the poor person automatically, when he sticks his hands in, would already assume the status of somebody who has placed the object on the floor, and he'd be liable. Let's discuss another case. Similar case, 2 people involved, but if you watch closely, there's a difference in which now one person is going to be doing all the acting. You were standing in one of the 2 domains. And here we'll take a look at this picture. Upashat chaveiro yad mirishut shniya v'natal chefetz miyad zeh ha'omed birishut zu v'yichniso etzlo. The friend sticks out his hand from the second domain, takes the object from the hands of the first person in the other domain, and brings it in. In this case, the homeowner stuck his hand out. The poor person was holding the basket outside of the door. The homeowner reaches out, takes the basket from the guy's hands, and brings it into the house. What happened here? The Baal Abayit, the owner of the house, did both. He lifted it from an important place, because remember, when the hands are in the same possession, the same domain as the rest of the body, they're considered to be an important place, 4x4. He took the thing off of a place of 4x4. He did the akira, a valid akira, and then he puts it into his house. That's a valid hanacha, a valid landing. Or the opposite. Or, again, the guy standing out there with no basket, just his hands open. The Baal Abayit takes the loaf off of his table and puts it into the guy's hands. He did both a valid akira and a valid hanacha, a valid lifting and a valid placing. He took something out of his place where he is and puts it in the hand of the guy that's standing there. The person standing, the poor guy, didn't do anything. Either the homeowner put something into his hand or took it out of his hand. The friend, the homeowner, will be liable because he did both the lifting and the placing. A beautiful case in Masechet Shabbat, which is applied in halacha. Let's say you were standing in one of the 2 domains, private or public. And your friend loaded something onto your back. We got delivery guys loading it onto his back. Once the stuff has been loaded, he now walks out with a loaded bag onto the other domain. The amad sham, and he stops, chayav, he's liable. Lifting your body with a load on it, is like lifting the object from within the domain. Stopping on the other side, the other domain, with the object on your back, is like putting the object down on the ground. In other words, with this halakha, the Rambam is communicating to us a new principle. Lifting and placing doesn't have to be lifting from the domain and putting it into the domain. As long as the object is somewhere which is considered to be the domain, You have to just lift it from there. So your back is considered to be in the domain. You lift your body, the object is now being lifted. You stop your body, the object is now being placed. Therefore, were you to have gone out with the object in your hand or on your back and not stop in the next domain, you keep going back and forth. Even if you're constantly going out and going back in all day till Shabbat ends, patur, we cannot hold you biblically liable. Because all you did was uplift. You lifted the object by moving your body with the stuff on your back, but you never stopped. And even if you do stop, but it's with the purpose of fixing the load, you didn't stop just to rest, you're still going to be exempt till you stop to rest. Stopping to rest, that's considered a hanacha. Somebody who has a load on his back, this guy's pizza delivery, and he's running around all day. He never becomes liable till he stops. The stopping is considered the hanacha, the placing. That's provided that you are running. But if you walk slowly, each step that you take, that's like lifting and placing, and it's forbidden. The Rambam uses the word forbidden because it's only rabbinically forbidden. The reason why in other words, technically, biblically, there is no problem. Walking is not considered an actual placing, but the rabbis were concerned you might stop to rest, in which case you're actually carrying. Other people might learn from you. You might learn from yourself. On a future Shabbat, you'll remember, you'll carry. So that's why we can't consider this to be a kosher thing, and the rabbis forbade it. Therefore, if somebody finds himself, Shabbat is coming in, and you have a load on your back, the solution for this is, don't want to walk, because if you walk, that's forbidden rabbinically. Run with it. Once you realize that you're holding it, till you reach your house, then kind of chuck it in an abnormal manner. This we do even till today. You got something on your back, you didn't realize, or Shabbos comes in, you run to your house and drop it in your house. If you have a wallet in your pocket or something like that, it's not that simple. The commentaries say you can't just rely on that and run, because it's still normal to run with a wallet in your pocket. The whole idea of running is that you're doing it in an abnormal way. But here, if you're running, you're doing it in a normal way. So the solution that you should just keep walking, but just don't stop walking. Or we'll see later, if you can, stop in the middle of the road and put it onto a place that's called makom ptur, a place of exemption. We'll talk about this more later today and tomorrow. Halacha Yud, akar hachefetz mereshut harabim. If you uprooted something from the public domain, the halach bo pachot me'arba amot ve'amad, and you walked the space less than 4 amot, you haven't transgressed the violation of transferring something 4 cubits, you stopped. The chazar ve'halach pachot me'arba amot ve'amad, and then again you go, and less than 4 amot, and you stop. Afilu kol hayom kulo patur, even all day, rabbinically it's forbidden, but you're biblically exempt, because you haven't actually carried 4 amot straight. When do we talk about this? Only when you stop to rest. But if you stop to simply fix your load, you're like walking, and you're not considered to have stopped. So counterintuitively, you stopped. This is a case where when you stop to fix your load, it makes it worse. In the last case, when you stop to fix your load, it isn't considered stopping, only when you stop to rest. Here, since you're looking to stop before the 4 amot end, so when it comes to stopping to rest, that's a good stop. It stops your carrying, and now you've done only less than 4 amot. But if you only stop to fix your load, you haven't fully stopped, and when you keep walking, you're going to be violating the transgression of transferring something 4 amot. Of course, that's only if you're going to stop then to rest as well. But if in that case, after the 4 amot pass, you're going to stop just to fix your load, now it'll work to your advantage. You'll still be like somebody that's walking, and you aren't obligated, you aren't liable till you stop to rest outside the area of the 4 cubits. Halacha Yud Aleph. You have a long reed or a long spear lying on the ground. You lift one edge, while the second edge remains attached to the ground, and you chucked it in front of you. Here's a video of them doing it with a tire. You have a tire, you pick it up, boom, lets it bounce on the other side. Then you go to the second edge, which remained in place. Now it's the first edge, and you lift it up. That one that was on the ground. And again, you bump it over to the other side. So you're moving the spear along the road, but you haven't actually lifted the entire thing at once. Until you transfer the object many, many miles, kilometers. Patur, you're exempt because you never lifted the entire object from the ground. But if you were to pull the object and drag it along on the earth, from the beginning of 4 to the end of 4 cubits, you would be liable. Because when you roll it or drag it, you're actually lifting it. The entire object is moving. When you just flip it, there's that one part of the object which actually isn't moving. Halacha Yud Bet. An interesting case. You lifted the object from within your domain, perfectly acceptable akira, but you did it with the intent simply to move it somewhere in your house. You lifted it from one corner of the living room, you're planning to bring it to the dining room. So the lifting which was done was a permissible lifting. Then you're holding it in your hand, you know what? I should take this outside. You change your mind in the middle of the walk and take it out to a second domain. Even if you placed it in the other domain, patur, you'll be exempt. Because the original lifting wasn't done with that intent. So you have only a placing without a lifting. Similarly, would be the case if you lifted an object and you just dump it on your friend's back as he's walking. Then you see your friend wants to stop, poof, you pick it up. You pick it up from your friend. You're going to be exempt. You've never created a full placing and lifting. There's only a lifting. Each time when you put it on your friend's back while he was walking, that wasn't a full placing. He was still walking. You lifted it again, and you put it on again. Each time you never fully placed it, or never fully stopped. Halacha Yud Gimel, now we move on to the laws of throwing. Hazorek chefetz, mereshut lireshut, o mitchilat arba lesof arba b'shut harabim. You throw an object from one domain to the other, from the beginning of 4 to the end of 4 cubits in the public domain. The kodem sheyanuach. Now, typically, if you would let it land, you'd be liable. We said in yesterday's chapter, throwing is like carrying. But then before it lands, klato acher biyado. Boom, the football player rolls in, bottom left there, catches the football in middle of the air. Or klato kelev, or a dog rises in the right there, catches the ball. On yisraf, or in middle of the, it's flying, the plane, it explodes. Patur, you're exempt. That isn't the landing, that isn't the placing which you intended. Therefore, of course, if you were practicing some running passes with the football players, and you threw the football and there he goes, boom, catches it, then chayab, then you're liable. Otherwise, if it's an unintended landing, it's not considered a landing. I'm sorry, if you throw something from one domain to the other, you're throwing a ball, but the ball is attached to your hand by a string. It was tied to a rope and the knot is in your hand. If you're powerful enough to still pull the object back to you, patur, you're exempt. Because there is no full placing. It's like lifting without placing. Lifting without placing. I'm just looking here in my notes. We said earlier that in the case of the poor man and the owner, were he to put his hands, within 3 tfachim of the ground, wouldn't that be considered a placing? But the Or Sameach says that over here, because you're throwing it, it gets a different law than if you're just passing it with your hand. Passing with your hand is different. Passing with your hand, you reach 3 tfachim, boom, it's placed. You're throwing it, there is no hand over there holding onto it, so it gets a different set of laws. Halachat Tedvav. You throw something and it lands in your friend's hand. If it was just by chance, your friend's sitting there, hands open, boom, you throw a ball, it lands. You are liable for throwing it. You lifted and you placed, but your friend, nothing to do. The friend wasn't even relevant. The point is you. You threw it, he was standing there, that's what you intended, it lifted, it landed, you're liable. But if your friend had to move from his place to catch it, patur, then you're exempt, because that isn't the hanacha that you intended for. Zarak, if you threw up an object, and you ran after yourself, after the object, and you caught it in your hand in the other possession, other domain, or outside of 4 amot in the public domain, patur, you are exempt, as though somebody else had moved and caught it. When somebody else moves and catches it, it's not considered to be your placing that you intended to have it, and therefore you're exempt. Here too, you'd also be exempt. Because placing is only considered to be a complete placing when the object lands in the place where it should have landed at the time that you lifted it. You throw from one private domain to another private domain, and there's a public domain in the middle. Even though the object passed through the airspace of the public domain, patur, you are exempt. It's not considered to have rested. This is what's called kluta kemisha huncha. If something is flying, isn't considered to be as though it's landed. So even though it's flying through the airspace of the public domain, it's not considered to have landed. Of course, it has to traverse the public domain at a height of more than 3 tfachim. But if it traversed the Reshut HaRabim at a height of less than 3 tfachim from the ground, then v'nachal gabei mashehu, if it rested on something, or it's considered to have rested on something, even if it then lifted or rolled away, there's 2 words here, meshut hayachid, that are extra, that should be deleted in most Rambams, they don't exist. The object went out to another private domain. Since it traversed at a height at less than 3 tfachim, we have the principle of lavud, as I mentioned before, as attached. It's considered attached to the ground. Certainly if it actually stopped in Reshut HaRabim and then it rolled further, and you'd be liable for transferring something from a private domain to a public one. The opposite. You throw from one public domain to another public domain with a private domain in the middle. Patur, you'd be exempt, because even though it passed through the private domain, it isn't considered to have landed. But if the object traversed at a height less than 3 tfachim, less than 3 handbreadths from the ground, when it landed on something, even though it later on rolled around or went out to the other public domain, it's as though it remains standing in the private domain in the middle, and therefore you're liable. It's like you carried from a public domain to a private domain. Same case as the last one. There's a public domain here, public domain there, private domain in the middle. You transfer an object 4 amot, but you didn't do it in a row. You did 2 amot at the end of this domain. You threw it over the Reshut HaRabim, and it lands 2 amot in the other public domain. So you have 2 and 2, together it's 4, only if you combine them. Chayav, you're liable. 2 sets of 2 amot. In other words, 4 amot comprised of 2 domains, 2 public domains, combined. Because the object never came to rest in the Reshut HaYachid, in the private domain in the middle. A person who passes something over from a private domain to a private domain with a public domain in the middle. Let's say you have here a narrow street, 2 balconies on the side. Somebody passes a long beam from one balcony to the other over the public domain. Chayav, you're liable. I mentioned this yesterday. We're going to get much more into this tomorrow. Public domain only extends to the height of 10 handbreadths, about 40 inches in the air. Once you passed 40 inches in a Reshut HaRabim, it's not considered to be the airspace of Reshut HaRabim. However, for this law, for the law of passing from a private domain to a private domain over a public domain, even if you passed it higher than the airspace of the public domain, you're still going to be liable. Sheken hayda avodat haLevim b'mishkan. Because in the Mishkan, when it came to transport in the tabernacle in the desert, the Leviim would pass from a private domain to a private domain over the space of a public domain. Moshitin et hakrashim me'agala la'agala. They would pass the beams from one wagon to the other. The Rambam himself actually drew this diagram in his commentary to the Mishnah. Of course, it's a pretty primitive diagram, but it brings out the point. That's the wagons over here. That's the wagons over here. These are the beams. These are the krashim, and they used to hand them from one to the other. Each wagon was considered to be a private domain. So they passed from private domain to private domain over the space of a public domain. When do we say that? When the 2 private domains were on the length of the public domain. Like the wagons which travel one behind the other. So actually before my depiction was inaccurate. I was talking about a balcony from one side to the other. We're actually talking about this, where you have 2 balconies on one side of the Reshut HaRabim. So yes, when you pass over from one balcony to the other, you're passing over the airspace of Reshut HaRabim, but you're doing it on one side, lengthwise, like the Leviim did in the desert. But if it was the other case that I showed you before, this case, passing from one side to the other side of Reshut HaRabim, af hamoshit me'reshut hayachid zu l'reshut hayachid shekenegda patur. Even passing and certainly throwing will exempt you. We can't hold you biblically liable because that isn't the way that the Leviim did it. And since it isn't the way the Leviim did it, we're looking at a case of passing from a private domain to a private domain over the airspace, not of a public domain, because it's above 10 tfachim. It's above a height of 10 handbreadths. Halacha chaf. Shachach. Upashat yado v'himalei aperot. You forgot. You stretched out your hand. It's full of produce. V'hotzi'ah mechatzer zu lahachnisa lechatzer shebitzida. You took it out of one courtyard to put it into a second courtyard. V'niskar kodem sheyachnis, and you remembered before you brought it back in, whoops, I did something wrong. I put it from one domain to the other. And now your hand is hanging in the space of a public domain. Mutar lahachzirai lav lachatzero, you can bring your hand back. You can bring your hand back. In other words, you're on the way. I'm sorry, I interpreted it wrong. You're on the way to put it into the next one. V'niskar kodem sheyachnis. There's a courtyard here, public domain in the middle. You're on your way from one to the other and your hand stops in the public domain. You can bring it back. But certainly to put it into the next courtyard would be forbidden. So you shouldn't fulfill the thought that you had while you were making the mistake. But if you put your hand out purposely, says the Rambam, it's forbidden to bring your hand back. The rabbis find you that your hand is going to be hanging there until it gets dark. Too bad on you. The Maggid Mishnah points out that, of course, if you did this at a stage that's higher than 10 tfachim, you're not even in the airspace of the Reshut HaRabim. You're not in the airspace of the public domain, and so you actually could bring your hands back. What if a person wants to throw something 8 amot in a public domain? He wants to throw. He knows that 4 amot is forbidden. He wants to throw it 8, even more than 4. But the object lands at the end of 4 amot. Chayav, you're still liable, even though it didn't land in the place that you intended to. But you did intend it to pass 4 amot. The minimum amount of the malacha was done. And your thought was also fulfilled. Because everybody knows an object cannot reach a distance of 8 amot till it reaches every single incremental point on that space, including the space of 4 amot. But if the opposite were true, you only wanted to throw it 4 amot and it landed at 8 amot, then you'd be patur, then you'd be exempt. Because it landed in a place where you didn't think it would land, you didn't plan for it to land. You didn't even want it to pass there, certainly not to land there. If you threw a ball in the public domain and you didn't think where you wanted it to land, you say, you know what, let it land where it lands, then you're liable everywhere, because everywhere is a qualifying place for past the 4 forbidden amot in Reshut HaRabim. You threw something within the space of 4 amot. It was permitted what you did. And then the ball rolled outside of 4 amot. Patur, you're exempt. You did a prohibited throwing. You threw it out of the square of 4 amot. Then it rolled back in, luckily, within 4 amot. If before it rolled in, it had rested, it had come to rest at something in the public domain, and only then did it roll back, come to the 4 amot, chayav, you're liable. But if it didn't rest at all, it simply bounced and then rolled back in, so we consider the final stage of the throwing to happen when it comes back in, and luckily for you, harezeh patur, you are exempt. Of course, rabbinically it's forbidden to do it, but bottom line is we can't hold you accountable.